Hello, thank you for joining us for home worship. I am back from vacation and this is current, so you're watching this sermon and it is current to the middle of July, whatever time you're watching it. I'm recording it in anticipation for the July 18th Sunday. And so today, the lectionary for this morning includes the Psalter of Psalm 23. And here it is from the NRSV. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. One of the concerns of preaching on the 23rd Psalm is our familiarity with it. It's the psalm we had to memorize in Sunday school in order to get a gold star. And so what we see in it is the metaphors of shepherd and host. God is the metaphor of shepherd and host. The author's impression of God and the nature and character of who God is according to these metaphors. And the psalm acknowledges these traits about God until the language changes in verse 4. And it goes from talking about God to talking to God. That's actually a giant leap, as we can see from where that comes from. Because if you look, this psalm is placed right after Psalm 22. And the 22nd psalm starts out like this. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? And verse 2, my God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Psalm 22, the psalm just preceding the famous 23rd. Yes, you probably hear it too. It's the words Jesus borrowed from this psalmist in his most desperate hours on the cross. You see, the gospel message is here in the 23rd Psalm, verse 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley. You know, you could replace the darkest valley with almost anything. Even though I suffer drastic changes in society and the threat of contagious diseases, even though I face a severe diagnosis, even though I see the pain and suffering of my loved ones, even though I am plagued with loss and grief, even though I am pinned under a collapsed building, even though I am pursued with violence, even though I live under an oppressive dictatorship that causes me to live out my faith underground. And of course, I'm referencing what's going on in Cuba right now. Even though I will fear no evil. Someone once asked me, I feel as if it was many, many months ago, Someone once asked me to preach on this psalm. Why don't you preach a sermon on the 23rd Psalm? I actually forget who it was, but I'll never forget the request. I don't often get requests for specific scriptures to be preached on or specific sermons. I mean, who wants a sermon after all? But the person, and I believe it was a she in my imagination or my mind's eye, it was a she. She was so in love with this psalm that she wanted to hear a sermon on it. And so when it came up in the lectionary for today, I couldn't resist. Number one, I'd had the request given me, and number two, I really love that song, "The King of Love, My Shepherd Is." Beautiful. So we'll sing that together. And I was on vacation prior to today with my family. And I asked my brother, pastor like me, if he knew of a good sound exegesis of the 23rd Psalm. And he just gestured towards his wife. Yeah, the Reverend Denmark there. He said, yeah, Shelley did a great sermon back in 2014 on the 23rd Psalm in a sermon series at his church. He was a guest preacher there. And so I went to the archive of his church and I discovered a soul-stirring sermon. A sermon on the Psalm that she preached just weeks before her own cancer diagnosis. The sermon's on June 22nd, 2014, and by the first week of October of that same year, she would undergo a bilateral mastectomy to try to beat the cancer. She was in a dark valley, for sure. And the service that we will hold in our sanctuary on Saturday of this week was for an even younger woman than my sister-in-law was when she battled breast cancer, who lost her battle to brain cancer, leaving behind a small child, a husband, and the people who I, as a parent of a teenager, identify with most, the grieving parents. They are certainly walking in a dark valley. And for me, the beauty of this psalm, and I think why my requester was so in love with it, and why we are taught to memorize it, is because the gospel confession is embedded in it. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. And the language changes, for you are with me. These are words that we can cling to in the darkest valley. These are the words we can hold on to. These are the words of hope that carry us through the valley and promise to pursue us with goodness and mercy all the days of our life. Sure, it's beautiful poetry from a literary standpoint, and it's short and relatively easy to memorize. But the reason it's so compelling is because it's indicative. It is indicative of the life of faith, a life of joy. My cup overflows. A life of peace, resting beside still waters and the dark valleys too. The reality of what it means to live in this flesh and on this planet. And even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This week, there has been a call to action for the people of Cuba from the organization called Methodist United in Prayer. And this call to action has been endorsed by our bishop, Bishop Kim Carter, and also the bishop of the Methodist Church in Cuba, Bishop Ricardo Pereira. In the last few days, it says, we have witnessed in shock and despair the violence against peaceful protesters that erupted following the president of Cuba's call to defend the Cuban Revolution from ideological subversion. Attacks on unarmed citizens, including children and elderly people, have led to many deaths, while hundreds have been taken to undisclosed locations after being beaten and shot at. So the call to action is that those of us, those Methodists united in prayer, would echo the words of the church in Cuba that condemns all violence against the people of Cuba. Furthermore, that we would call on the churches in the state of Florida and across our nation to fast and pray for the people. And it's based on the passage in Isaiah about the fast that God has chosen for us, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Isaiah 58:6. They've also asked us to give towards the relief for the people of Cuba through the Methodist Church in Cuba. They're just making do with very, very little in Cuba. Creative, blessed souls, and they're worshiping in house churches. They've also asked us to send letters to our nation's leaders, to the president, to the Senate, to the House of Representatives, asking that our nation get involved in this struggle. Even though economically as a nation we have a lot to gain, let's question that and let's put morals in front of economic gain to lift the Methodist Church in Cuba up in prayer in our worship service. They ask us to cry out ourselves on behalf of our brothers and sisters just to the south of us. So would you join me in a prayer for our brothers and sisters in Cuba who face oppression, fear, and dark valleys this very day?